For more, let's bring in Weijia Jiang and Chris Cadelago. Weijia is CBS News' senior White House correspondent, and Chris is a White House correspondent for Politico. Weijia, politically, defeating COVID is what this president campaigned on. How has he been able to deliver, and where are they falling short, especially given now that we have this concern that this new subvariant of Omicron could eventually reach U.S. shores?
Well, to that very point, Ed, I think one of their weak points has been some muddled messaging that we've seen really across the board along the way from the CDC and then from the White House as a result of it. As an example, you'll remember that on July 4th, the president declared that we were close to being independent from the virus. And then a couple months later, there was that huge Delta variant that surged that was actually more severe than the original variant. In other cases, there has been confusion over masking guidance because shortly around that time, the CDC director also okayed peeling back from masks. And then once you say that, it's difficult to get people to go back to wearing them. And then, even when it comes to isolation periods or what kind of masks people should wear, I think that is where this administration has struggled a bit to be very clear about exactly what people should do, when they should do it. But at the same time, that's because the science continues to evolve, right? I mean, at the time when the president said that, the White House says at the time the Delta variant was not yet in the U.S. and it looked like we were ready to turn a page. So I think that's what's happening right now. I think, even though Asia and Europe has historically sort of set the scene for us for what's to come, right now the White House has received some criticism for downplaying what that subvariant could do, because we know that it's already here. So I think that we'll have to watch this carefully. The press secretary today reiterated that they are watching it carefully, but the timing doesn't exactly work out because, again, the CDC just relaxed its guidelines. So it's difficult to square these two things. But I think one thing we'll hear over and over from officials here, Ed, that you hear all the time, too, is that they will continue to follow the science. And if the science shows something different, their message will be different. In terms of his successes, I mean, shortly after he took office, the president was able to pass the American Rescue Plan, which was nearly $2 trillion in response to the pandemic. At that time, it was still, at a peak. It put money directly into people's hands. It expanded unemployment benefits, the child tax care credit, and expanded testing centers. Also, 66% of the general population is considered fully vaccinated, which is a high marker. And so I think that's why you hear all the time that they talk about how they've been able to get so many people vaccinated and share nearly 500 million doses with more than 100 countries around the world. And they have put quite an emphasis on this global response. So I think there's a lot that they can point at what they have done. But again, you can't really quantify their success overall until we get closer to the end, whenever that may be.
Or maybe it's as things have been turned down, how successful the CDC, the administration, state, local, and federal government is at turning it back up if need be, the protections, the mandates, the mask rules. As some doctors have suggested that this is a knob that can be turned down and up depending on the rise in cases and whether the country's flexible enough to do that. I know one of the things we've been following today in the White House unit is the president, the vice president, and the Speaker of the House have all been in proximity to people with COVID-19 in recent days. Tell us a little more about those cases and whether any special precautions are being taken by those three people at the top of the chain of power, chain of command.
Yeah, so just 2 days ago, we learned that the second gentleman, Doug Emhoff, tested positive for COVID-19, and the vice president's office tells us that she tested negative on Tuesday, and since then continues to take precautions. As an example, she canceled a trip that she was planning to take to Louisiana today. She has canceled some other events on her schedule, and she continues to wear a mask anytime she is around other people, because the CDC guidance is if you come in close contact with somebody who has COVID-19. If you are fully vaccinated and boosted, you don't have to quarantine. You can still be out and about if you wear a well-fitting mask. And the White House said that the president is not considered a close contact of Mr. Emhoff's, and so he's in the clear there. He's also in the clear, according to officials here from the Taoiseach of Ireland, who is in town, and they were supposed to have a meeting here at the White House. We know that the president, and you know this very well, Ed, is very proud about being Irish American, and the White House said he is very disappointed that he was not able to have that meeting in person. But right now, as we speak, he's still having a St. Patrick's Day ceremony celebration here at the White House. And, you know, I think what's really interesting is that they aren't taking extra precautions. Jen Psaki said that they will just continue to follow the CDC guidance. And so the president, she says, has not been tested since Sunday, and said that his doctor said there was no reason to be because he doesn't have any symptoms, because those two men are not considered close contacts. So they'll continue to monitor him, but they're not taking extra precautions with testing or with regard to anyone who's around him either. And then the House Speaker Nancy Pelosi, she actually was sitting right next to the leader of Ireland during a welcome dinner yesterday, and so far has not tested positive, but she is also out and about, so that's something that we'll be watching closely as well.
Well, we will see. And we should, not the chain of command, I meant to say the line of succession when talking about these three individuals. Now, otherwise, Weijia, the other thing they're worrying about or planning for there at the White House is the fact that the president is set to speak with the Chinese President Xi tomorrow. This afternoon, Mr. Biden discussed the upcoming call when they're going to be talking for the first time since meeting virtually in November.
I think we're in a genuine struggle between autocracies and democracies, and whether or not democracies can be sustained. And I'm going to be speaking to President Xi tomorrow, and he'll remind me that I told him, he remembers every damn thing I've said, unfortunately. But all kidding aside, we talked about the idea, he does not believe democracies can be sustained in the 21st century.
So real quick, Weijia, what's on the agenda for this meeting?
Well, I think they are planning to talk about a wide range of things, according to the White House, but really, Ed, this meeting is all about what China may or may not do with regard to Russia. We know that Russia has asked China for military assistance, for economic assistance, as it continues to fight Ukraine. And just today, Secretary of State Antony Blinken said that we are concerned that China is considering directly assisting Russia with military equipment. And so we fully expect the president, this is what his aides have said, will deliver a very firm message to China's Xi Jinping to make clear that if they help Russia at all, there will be severe consequences. And we know that this meeting came out of a 7-hour intense meeting with the National Security Advisor, Jake Sullivan, and the Chinese. And that's also the message that he took to them. So I think, you know, when we do get a readout, it will certainly mention the fact that the president had to communicate yet again, leader to leader, to stay out of this. Otherwise, there will be severe consequences to pay. Ed?
Yeah. Probably the most important phone call going on in the world tomorrow between these two leaders. We'll see how it goes. Yeah. Chris, let's bring you into this conversation. Earlier today, the House voted 424-8 to suspend permanent normal trade relations with Russia. If the Senate passes this as well, what does it actually mean the White House can do now?
So this is a vote that is a lot more symbolic than it is something that'll translate into real life. And part of that is a lot of trade experts and others have told us over the last month as the House prepared to do this, that just the level of sanctions we've seen from the administration, from across government, from across really the West and our European allies really sort of outdoes or outflanks what this vote does. Now, I think that what we saw in the process of this vote before arriving at this incredibly lopsided vote, where we saw folks like Lorraine Boebert and Marjorie Taylor Greene and Matt Gaetz as part of this 8 come up, was kind of this delicate dance between the House and folks over in Congress and the White House. And part of this had to do with the president really wanting to marshal our allies, really get on the same page with them about the steps we were taking. We saw the House try to move forward with this basically ending this trade status for Russia at the same time that they were looking at doing the ban on Russian oil. And we saw the White House step in, sort of raise their arm and say, please don't move forward with that part of it, and basically strip that language out in order for Biden and U.S. officials to sort of get on the same page and coordinate more with the allies in Europe. And so a lot of this, given just how strict and how tough these sanctions have been so far, we talk about what is even left for the U.S. and the West to do. This particular designation will tend to be more of a symbolic step than it will be something that has a massive economic impact on Russia.
Yeah, and the president also called Russian President Putin a, quote, war criminal at the White House yesterday. Even if Russia stops its assault on Ukraine right now, something we know isn't going to happen probably today, tomorrow, in the next few days, but if it does at some point, you get any sense from administration officials or lawmakers of how this military action stands to define U.S.-Russian relations going forward?
Yeah, I mean, this, not just U.S.-Russian relations, but really sort of the entire NATO group and beyond, those relations have been severed to the point that they haven't been in 40, 50 years. I mean, this is the steps that Vladimir Putin has already taken would seem to be sort of irreversible. I mean, he will never be in the status that he once thought to want to be. There's basically, in short, there's no coming back from this for Vladimir Putin. And I think what we saw from President Biden was, we heard the press secretary say he was speaking from the heart. We saw when he made those comments initially, he kind of said something and then came back and really wanted to clarify that he does believe he's a war criminal. And this was really a personal statement from Joe Biden. And we've heard from U.S. officials that there are, any number of legal designations that need to be reached, things that go back to the Geneva Accords, tribunals that can happen that really do figure out if Vladimir Putin does meet the definition of a war criminal. But we've heard from members of Congress who, before Joe Biden made this declaration on his own, have been urging him to say that. That was happening all the way up until the hour that he did say it. They point to things like these bombings of hospitals, bombings of residential buildings that folks are in as evidence that he is. So the legal question on that and whether there is any kind of punishment here will come later. But for now, this was something that Biden wanted to say. He is not coming back from this in terms of his status with the U.S. and much of the world. And this is very much, without trying to predict history, certainly a way that he will be remembered.
Absolutely. No, that's for certain. Well, Chris Cadelago with Politico and Weijia Jiang, of course, our senior White House correspondent, who stuck around on her wedding anniversary to talk to us. We appreciate that. Thanks to you both.